am going to talk tonight about this question of assimilation, and I have put it in quotation marks to definitely highlight that this is something to be debated, whether it's how we define it or we debate whether it ever happened or what it means. And I think the best place to start is to think about the assumptions that we bring to thinking about Native people in US history, because we tend to think about them in terms of cultural encounters or racial encounters. But really what we need to understand is that their place in US history is one in terms of imperial politics between nations, between their nations and the United States. And what we should think about, and one of the easiest ways to make your students actually understand that, is to talk about treaties. That basically every single time Britain and then the United States signed treaties with Native peoples, they were acknowledging that those people belonged to a Native nation who were foreign nations that had formal political relationships with the governments of Britain and then the United States. And so if we think about now, oh, there we go. Okay. And we can see this in very, very clear ways. One, and you'll figure out various, I love maps and what they can tell us in terms of sources. And so here we've got a British map from 1760, and you can see that they are showing the multiplicity, the density of Cherokee towns across this landscape. And if we zero in on the corner, they are absolutely recognizing that this is the map of a nation that they are recognizing. We can see that throughout the 18th century, the Cherokee sent diplomats to London to meet with different British officials, and these were also documented. So we can see this painting here where they're, and pay attention to the garb since I'll be talking about this later. And here is a newspaper story. I'm not going to read the whole thing just to save time, but it will be in the PowerPoint, and you can, since I know you'll get the PowerPoint, you can use this with your own students, but it is a newspaper account of these visiting dignitaries. And here again is yet another newspaper account of some of these dignitaries in London. Nothing changed when the United States was created if we look at this map. And I think, again, to think about different primary sources and documents you can use in your classrooms, I think maps are really some of the most extraordinary things, partly because this has just become so much more meaningful recently, because I would say in the last 10 years, many of the archives and museums and libraries that house these maps, because some of these are huge, have digitalized them, and they all come with zoom functions. And all of a sudden, actually, you can use these maps in ways, right? If you asked your students to look at this map, you know, what could they really tell? But when you zoom in, what you see is that, of course, the United States are recognizing, and again, this is a map from 1783, the formal border, the boundary between the Carolinas, between the United States and the Cherokee Nation. And again, you can see the density of Cherokee cities on this map. And again, you know, one of the easiest things to think about in terms of students and making them understand is just to say, okay, well, today, who does the United States make treaties with? And they know, right? The United States only makes treaties with foreign nations. So every single time the United States signed a treaty with Native people, they were recognizing implicitly and explicitly the sovereignty of that Native nation. So how do we get to then thinking of all this instead as racial encounters or cross-cultural encounters and all the various languages, right? We think far more of the individual encounter. Oh, what did this Anglo-American think of that Native person and vice versa? It's like, no, 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 no. So the whole thing is that this whole idea of race, this construction of race, is a product of 19th century US imperialism. It is a product of the political relations that we're talking about here. And what we have to understand is that throughout the 19th century, intensifying as the 19th century went along, US imperial, or we might say colonial policy, and I say colonial with great purpose, right? That we tend to, in traditional historical terms, say, oh, the colonial period ended with the creation of the United States, but it absolutely did not, because the United States in their imperial policies turned Indian nations into colonial subjects. And so I always laugh when scholars want to say, oh yes, I'm going to use post-colonial theory to discuss this. Like, why? We're not post-colonial. We're still, as long as Native nations in the United States do not have full sovereignty, then we have not reached a post-colonial moment. So back to the 19th century. So this 19th century imperial or colonial policy of the United States had very clear goals when it came to these Native nations. One, they cast all Native people as savage. They then denied, slowly but surely, inexorably, they wanted to deny the sovereignty of Native nations, that their borders, of course, were not sovereign and didn't deserve any respect. And they wished to reduce all Indians to subordinated subjects of US rule. In doing all of this then, right, they tried to make all Native people, all these different Native nations who all spoke different languages, who have different cultures, different ideas, all these different nations, they said, constituted a race, a single unified race of Indians. Okay, so how is this going to go about? And again, there we go. Okay, yet another textbook map that I absolutely hate. So we can see, right, this is trying to show us the early expansion of the United States. And this is, again, like I said, from a textbook. But of course, this is absolutely distorting any understanding a student might have of this era, because what it's not showing is this reality, that there was no inch of North America that was not claimed, settled, and ruled by Native nations. And so what we have to understand, the reality of that map is this, that the United States was sharing borders with multiple Native nations who had absolutely no interest in allowing the invasion and denial of their national borders. And I should also point out, in 1800, everything that you see in orange there, also 50% of that, 50% of what the United States claimed were their borders, 50% of that was also still in the hands of Native nations. So even the orange is a fiction. Okay, so what's going to happen in the 19th century? So beginning really in the 1780s, I should say, citizens of the United States will leave the United States. They will transgress US borders. They will cross the borders of Native nations, and they will take up squatter presence in these other nations. They will found these invasive squatter communities that begin hunting, they're trapping, they're clearing land, they're diverting waters. And of course, all of these things begin to impinge on Native subsistence and economic systems. This inevitably produces conflict. The squatter communities then raise militias and war breaks out, or fighting breaks out. And they then, because they're not winning, call on the United States for military aid. The United States Army then transgresses US borders. They leave the United States. They enter another nation, where they then fight the people of that nation until the point that they come to peace negotiations. And in those peace negotiations, those treaties of peace, they always demand land cessions as a promise of peace from the United States. This process will happen 1,642 times between 1787 and the end of the 19th century. This is how vast tracts of Native land were subsumed and incorporated into the US empire. It is utterly illuminating then to think about the terms in which US officials, and then of course our textbooks and popular culture today, speak about these relations. There's a shift in the characterization of what's going on from the beginning to the end of the 19th century. And so if you think about it, in the early 19th century, we can speak of the United States negotiating and dealing with the Cherokee Nation. By the end of the 19th century, the United States will speak about dealing with individuals like Geronimo, like Sitting Bull, and they will cast them as specifically that. They are individuals who are leaders of bands, of warriors who are causing trouble and supposedly, right, causing violence against innocent bystanders. And so they are deemed outlaws. And so what you see then in this transition over the 19th century is that all those peace treaties with their land cessions then began adding reservations to the mix. And so the reservations then, and what we have to understand in terms of the meaning and the creation of reservations, were that these were open air prisons. These were concentration camps where Native people were under guard and under surveillance at all times. And right, because where else are you going to put outlaws? And that these would then become centers for the coerced re-education of these prisoners. And so the whole point was Indian nations were to be destroyed and reduced to individuals who would then be subject to coerced assimilation and US rule. Okay. If we then look though at the beginning of this process and we go back to these early relations and interactions and conflicts that involve the Cherokee Nation, what we find is that the beginning of the story of reservations foretells the end of the story of reservations. And that is a story of the utter failure of US policy. This is not simply because Native people resisted. It is because Indians first transformed those reservation prisons into new homelands. And they used those treaties that I just talked about, all those treaties that had been used coercively to dispossess them of their land as the greatest legal tools to reinstitute their sovereignty. So what you see, and so here's a map, and this was created in 1979 by the Indians Claims Commission. So this was a commission created by the US government. And everything you see in white in this map are areas and lands that the United States recognizes that they never legally took from Native nations. Now, we can discuss also, of course, all those areas that are marked ceded or even contested, but just pause for a moment to consider how much of North America the United States is willing to concede that they never gained legally. And this is what the treaties, this is where the treaties become critical. And throughout the 20th century, we can talk about and we can track Native nations beginning to regain much of their lands. But this is also very much about regaining their sovereign governance as well. So to understand this map again, and please note the Cherokees are in white in this map, I want to start with their story so we can see how these things play out. So we'll go, why? This is not one. Okay, I got it. So another textbook map, which I hate, because look at this. It is showing you the grayscale of the 48 states, but those states, many of them did not exist. I mean, look, we all know West Virginia wasn't created until the Civil War. So this is a falsehood. And this is, again, just a reminder of what's going on in our textbooks, right? They are writing manifest destiny into the maps our students have to look at when they put those 48 states in before they ever existed. So I'm going to look at this map instead, right? So the Cherokee Nation was incredibly extensive. And one of the reasons I've chosen to talk about the Cherokees in terms of assimilation is that they're often considered the model for it, right? That they and the Creeks and the Chickasaws and the Choctaws and the Seminoles, right? We all know them as the 5 civilized tribes. So, right, this is the perfect place to begin with, the ones that whites recognized. Except that the whole notion here of assimilation is from the white perspective. If you ask any Cherokee today, what they will tell you, and I am quoting, is that they changed so that they could remain the same. So here, what we need to grapple with are two different things, I think, when it comes to this question of assimilation. One is this notion of what is authenticity and Indian identity, right? And what we tend to do with Native people and Native cultures is say, oh, well, you know, the pure, what was truly Native was at some point in the past. And we lock them down in time, we put them under glass, and we say, oh, ooh, here we are, I don't know, 1491, 1600, which date do we want to choose? But we say, ooh, this is when we had the perfect, unadulterated Indian. And any change after that is a loss of Indian identity, right? They're the only human beings on the planet where we say, oh, you changed, it's a loss. You're not as Indian. Somehow you've become less Indian by changing. So of course, what we would say to a Comanche today is, I'm sorry, if you don't live in a hide lodge and ride a horse, you're not really an Indian. You are not allowed to be an investment banker in downtown Dallas, right? Or you can be an investment banker, but that means that you've given up your Comanche identity and you're no longer Indian. So of course that's crazy, right? We cannot judge Native people somehow by standards we don't apply to any other humans in human history. So that's the one problem. The other thing is that, and which is far more important, is of course that what white people saw as assimilation among these nations was in fact really a process, their efforts to institutionalize their sovereignty, to make the reality of their nationhood recognizable to the United States. And so let me explain what I mean. So all of this will begin after the revolution. And what you, yeah, actually maybe I'll go back. We'll stay here for a minute. At the end of the American Revolution, the United States will declare that all Native nations who had been allied with Britain against the colonial rebels, they declared them defeated enemies and thus said, all your lands are forfeit, which of course was absurd, and it didn't work because they didn't have the power to enforce that. But they put all Native nations on notice, right, that they were not going to be fair and equitable neighbors in the world that was coming into being at this point. And so Cherokee leaders, among many other Native leaders, were faced with this issue of like, okay, one, we have to make the United States adhere to the promises they have committed to in treaties. And throughout this period in the 1780s and 90s, they are making a multitude of treaties with the Cherokees, among many others, right? And what they say, what they're thinking clearly is, okay, how do we make ourselves, our nationhood, visible and legible to the United States? What we need for them to understand is that in the exact same terms that they are saying that the United States is a sovereign republic, that we too have the same kinds of nationhood. We are also a self-supporting, functioning republic of farmers, right? These are the terms of sovereignty in the United States, and thus you will recognize us by the same terms. So what they're going to do, one, they create a light horse police force to guard their borders. So it's not quite a standing army, but it's awful close. They will create the Cherokee National Council. And what this is in fact, they're not changing their governance at all, but they are institutionalizing it ways that they hope that US officials will better recognize. So they still have a principal chief who's being advised by a council of advisors. And then they will add to that a judiciary. And so they will have a judiciary with the Supreme Court, and ultimately they will have a two-house legislature. They will also write a constitution that very much resembles the United States. And again, what we have to remember is they are not aping the United States. They are not trying to make them, they're trying to make their nationhood visible to the United States. So what you will note, right, is that it is written in Cherokee as well as English. The Cherokee is for the Cherokee. The English is so that US officials can read this document and understand what it is telling them about Cherokee governance and nationhood. And what's very important to understand in this Constitution too, is that what they did in terms of property law is that they said that all land within the Cherokee domain, within the sovereign borders of their nation, were the common property of all. So that to protect their lands, they basically said no individual can sell lands, because of course there were all sorts of illegal land speculators going around trying to cheat people out of land. So they made it illegal. But I do not want to confuse, this does not mean that Cherokees did not recognize private property. What they said was that any individual, then let's say there's one large clan who owns and governs this piece of property, and they farm and they have their household and they have their household economy here, that any improvements they make, so if you put a fence around your agricultural field, if you build farm buildings, the house you live in yourself, any improvements you make, those are your property. And I would like to add that Cherokee women had equal rights to the ownership of their improvements as well. And this is critical if we understand that the Cherokee Nation is matrilineal, so that women are the heads of these clans. So obviously, in order to write this Constitution, they had to transform their language or create a written equivalent of their language. And so what they start with is what you see here, which is Sequoia syllabary. And so what the syllabary was it was actually 85 syllables that make up Cherokee words. And that was what they started with, but then they very quickly also created an alphabet. And so you can see that here. And part of the reason for this was, of course, that you need to be able to print documents. And so they very quickly also then developed newspapers. And we can also see, and this is so cool, I just had to include it. So this was a discovery made only a few years ago in Alabama by archaeologists who found these drawings in the Cherokee language in this cave. And so what you have to understand is that caves were deemed sacred spaces because there's certain places in the landscape, often on very high precipices, but also in caves, where the natural and the supernatural worlds meet. And so this is a place of great power for leaders to gain power. It's also a great place for very important spiritual rituals. And so what this goes on to tell you, and so here's a very close-up, was that the leaders of the Cherokee lacrosse team had come to record the rituals that had taken place in that lacrosse match. And what you have to understand is that lacrosse was not simply a sport, but it was a way of adjudicating disputes, be they legal or imperial, with other native nations. And so so you can see them still, just to make it clear, in 1828, they are still maintaining traditional Cherokee rituals, recording them in Cherokee language, but doing so in a way that is part of these changes and adaptations taking place. Along with that, as I said, they developed newspapers, multiple newspapers. So this was one of the first ones, the Cherokee Phoenix. And then following that, there was the Cherokee Phoenix and Indians Advocate. And just to make the point here, what you should know is that the majority, by 1830, the majority of Cherokees could read and write in Cherokee. And more than a third of Cherokees could also read and write in English. And their literacy rates were far higher than any white community around them. And so all of this is a reflection of this literacy. And also to think about the newspapers, what you have to realize is, right, they had to develop a printing press and have one designed for them that had the Cherokee language, the type, in it. And so they got folks in Boston to create this printing press for them. And so here you can see the printing house itself. So that's all one set of changes that you can see. The next, we should turn to the economy. And the economy is changing too. One of the reasons it's changing is, of course, that their lands are being compressed, right? That they have expanding white settlements all around them. And often in these treaty negotiations they have done with the United States to maintain peace, they have ceded hunting territories. So they've got to do something to replace the loss of hunting territories. And so what they do is they adopt livestock and pastoral economic ventures. And so cattle, pigs, all those things, right? So you need something for a protein base in this, in their subsistence economy. And what you should think of too is that all of that is simply being added to an incredibly prosperous agricultural economy that has existed for more than 1,000 years. It's amazingly silly if you look back at the writings of reformers and politicians in this era, and they talk about, oh, the savage Indians who we must teach to farm, which is just, of course, ridiculous because Native people have been farming again for hundreds, thousands of years, and more than 60% of all Native societies in North America were agricultural. So just to keep in mind, adding livestock isn't necessarily changing, it's just expanding their agricultural production. Their agricultural production is also expanding quite a bit because, of course, they adopt enslaved African-American labor. So what you will see very quickly, and I'll show you examples in a minute, is that in fact they have a plantation economy. And so the wealthiest among the Cherokee Nation have plantations that look very similar to those of their white neighbors. Another outward sign of economic change can be seen in dress. And what we see first, and you should keep in mind, of course, that Cherokees, along with all their native nations, had been trading with various Europeans for hundreds of years, and of course, trading with one another before that for hundreds and hundreds of more years. So they had always been adding new materials to their economies and to their material culture. So here we see this beautiful portrait from 1791. This was actually done in London. So most likely, again, a diplomat. And he is wearing a dress shirt, but he's still, of course, he's accompanying this with silver adornments that are distinctly Cherokee, with the gorget and the earrings and the armband. And if we look at women's clothing, what you see in this very early period is, right, they're taking trade cloth. And a recent historian made the point, you know, that we talk about the history of the fur trade all the time. And she said, you know, we should really call it the cloth trade because, of course, Europeans are getting the fur, but Native people are getting the cloth. And in fact, cloth made up 60% of what Native people were trading the furs for. And so what you see is, so they're taking this cloth that has been made by someone else in another culture, but then they are adding, again, silver adornments, brooches, decorations to it to make it distinctive Native clothing. But of course, oh, and I'm added this one since y'all are in Texas. This is from 1830. So this is from the Jean Berlandier expedition that came up, sponsored by the Mexican government. It went through Texas to sort of see what was going on and to see the state of all the different Native nations there. So this is one of a series of portraits and watercolors done by Lino Sanchez Tapia. And so this is one of Cherokees. So again, also you should take note that these are clearly Cherokees who have left because of the harassments from the United States. They've left the East and they're already moving west at this point. But again, you can see this mix of clothing in their dress in the watercolor. But then of course, obviously, elites are going to be importing silk. So here you have very fancy clothing here. But then here you can begin to see this other cloth. But what we also see really, really quickly by the turn of the century, by 1800, is that Cherokee women are beginning to spin their own cloth. And so what's happening is that they're growing their own cotton. So they're spinning their thread and their cloth. And so they will say, we are making Cherokee cloth. This is our cloth. And so they don't see this at all as something that somehow, oh, we're now dressing like Anglo-Americans. Like, no, we're dressing like Cherokees. And so you can see here a Cherokee woman with her daughter at the spinning wheel. And then here you can see a store, because these women, of course, are then selling the cloth that they're making and making a profit from that as well. So as you can tell from these images I've been giving you, right, that there's also a change in the material of housing. And so what you see are variations according to, you know, the level of prosperity of different households. So here we might say, this is more, they would never use this term, but we might say a working class Cherokee home. And then as they get bigger and the property gets bigger, we can see what we might call middle class. And so we can see here at the expansion, and here you begin to see too, right? Again, those improvements that I was talking about, right? So you've got the, not simply the house, but you've got a smokehouse, a corn crib, a barn, all of those things, right? You can see this, what they will call their own property. And please note the fencing that is clearly also marking property lines. And here are interiors, so you get a sense of what this prosperous economy is bringing them via trade. And then we move to the plantation level. And so this is Alexander McCoy's home, and you can see Elijah Hicks is at the top of the map, but in the middle is the McCoy's house and farm. And again, you can begin to see this expansion, right? We've got stables, we've got a kitchen, we have homes for the enslaved laborers. So things are getting bigger and more elaborate. Here is the Boudinot home. Here is Elijah Hicks' home, who you just saw in the map. And here's John Ross, chief. And you can also, if you go online, you can also see the even more fabulous house he will build in Oklahoma. And here, I want to stop and give a little bit more detail. So here's Chief Joseph Van's house, and it's one of the best preserved. And you can go and see it today. And so here is his drawing room and his dining room, and one of the bedrooms upstairs. And you should know that John Van employed over 110 enslaved African-American laborers. He was, again, of the highest elite. Most Cherokees, just like most whites, really probably owned only 10 or fewer slaves. But again, this is a measure of this prosperity. And with this prosperity, right, these are huge areas of improvements and include fields and orchards and farm buildings, smith shops and mills. And so here I want to pause in and use these two censuses. They're 15 years apart, but it gives you a sense of the absolute expansion and just bursting prosperity of the Cherokee Nation at the beginning of the 19th century between the census of 1809 and the census of 1824. And obviously, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but I just want to point out a few things. So one, we have almost 800 looms and 2,500 spinning wheels. So again, that gets at that point of Cherokees producing their own cloth, Cherokee women. And so that productive artisan craft that's going on there. I would also note 18 schools, if we want to think about, right, that expanding literacy rate. And then what this is also not showing you is that there were 11 different newspapers by 1825 with thousands of books in all these Cherokee homes. So, is this assimilation? Does this tell us what is going on here in terms of material acquisition? And actually, would we say that anything in this chart is somehow uniquely white? Well, except maybe for owning slaves. But all of these, right, are outward aspects of an expanding economy. If we were to look inward, though, at the inner aspects of Cherokee society, what we would find is, of course, they have not changed their family structures at all, the structures of their clans, which remain matrilineal. They have not changed the laws that govern in their lands. They still have their own philosophy, their cosmology, and their own religion. So none of the things that, of course, are most important to making up who you are have changed at all. But far more important than that, far more important than anything that this chart might tell us, what we have to understand is Cherokees had absolutely no intention of ever becoming citizens of the United States, or in fact, of becoming European or Anglo. They were simply trying to make Cherokee sovereignty and nationhood, the reality of their nation, visible to their white neighbors, to the state of Georgia, and to the United States. Clearly, if you look at these censuses and everything it tells us, they were absolutely, undoubtedly, a self-supporting, functioning republic of farmers. And all of this was to no effect at all. Indeed, Cherokee wealth and prosperity only whetted the appetites and the greed of their white neighbors, of the state of Georgia, and the United States governments, who all sought to take that wealth for themselves. So we can pause in this moment to consider what Andrew Jackson will say when he attempted to justify the denial of Cherokee nationhood, which had been affirmed and recognized by the Supreme Court of the United States, when he said that removal will place a dense and civilized, by which he meant white, will place a dense and civilized population in large tracts of the country now occupied by few savage hunters. Cherokees were only a few savage hunters. It will separate the Indians under their own rude institutions and perhaps cause them gradually to cast off their savage habits. Of course, this is absolute nonsense, and he knew it was nonsense. And Georgia officials knew it was nonsense, and US officials knew it was all nonsense. But what this is telling you, and this is just this clearest of moments in terms of US policy, that this is a moment where the United States was saying, we don't actually care, as it turns out, however much you civilize yourself. You can wear whatever clothes you want. You can farm in whatever ways you can. You can develop your economy in whatever ways you may, but you are still Indians in our eyes. And that is a moment that constitutes race. That is a moment when it says culture and religion and economy, and none of that matters. You can change everything and you're still Indians and we're still taking your land. And more than that, of course, it's also constituting genocide. Because of course, according to Jackson, in reality, we must reconcile the mind to the extinction of one generation to make room for another. And thus he would send the US Army at gunpoint to take Cherokee families and leaders and everyone else, drive them out of their homes, their lands, and their nation, to hold them in internment camps for months before marching them west. But keep in mind, they will rebuild their nation when they get west. So here is the national seal. Please note that it says 1839. So of course they are saying that we reconstituted this nation in the West in 1839. And so this marks this new beginning of our nation. You can go to Oklahoma and you can see the national capital of the Cherokee Nations in Tahlequah. You can still read the Cherokee Phoenix, which is published in both Cherokee and English. If you drive around Tahlequah, you will see many signs that are also in both languages. And you will see, and I'm sure you have seen these in Texas, I've seen these in Texas, that of course all different Native nations have also adopted these license plates. I've seen a lot of Comanche license plates in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, most notably. But what I love about the Cherokees uniquely is, so when they instituted this in 2017, you'll note that what they said was that any Cherokee, no matter where they were in Oklahoma, so they didn't have to live in the jurisdictions where the Cherokee government still is in power. Any Cherokee, no matter where they were, if they got one of these license plates for their cars, and all revenue, 40% of all revenues would go to their schools. And in the first year alone, they were able to raise $5 million for their public schools, which I just think is a particularly lovely thing to think about since we're all educators here. But I also want to point out that it is not simply that this is a failure of policy because the Cherokee Nation was able to reconstitute themselves in Oklahoma. It's also a failure because, of course, this battle of seeking to regain sovereignty is ongoing. This is a part of the history that we are living in now. My students love this because all of a sudden they're like, oh, right, ooh, we're living in history. This is going on right now. And one of the most awe-inspiring, I think, moments came this summer when the Supreme Court ruled in July in the McGirt versus Oklahoma case, where they said that, in fact, the sovereignty of the Creek Nation, the case only dealt with the Creek, but this is a map. And of course, it will govern, this ruling will have very great significance for all these other Native nations, right? But they said that the reservation and the nation had never been dissolved. And so, of course, the borders of those nations still exist. And the Creek still have sovereign power within the borders of their reservations. So I return you to this, because you should know that within a week of that ruling in July, the Mandan and Adastas were one of the first to begin filing suits. And so we are going to see this play out, I think, in really exciting and interesting ways. So hold on tight. So I'm going to stop there, and I will happily take questions.